In the sanctuary of Artemis at Ephesus in the summer of 41 BCE, a woman who once wore a royal diadem was dragged from sanctuary and executed. Ancient authors record the moment. Plutarch in Antony 41, Cassius Dio in Roman history, and Appian in civil wars describe soldiers violating the temple asylum to remove and kill Arsinoe IV, sister to Cleopatra VII. Archaeological work at the Artemision confirms continuous cult activity into the Roman imperial period, and inscriptions preserved on site attest to the long-held right of asylum in that sanctuary. This matters because temple refuge was legally sacred. Its violation was a deliberate political signal. If you enjoy these dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you're listening from. I'm genuinely curious to know where these stories reach. Plutarch's account is clear on dates and actors. Marcus Antonius himself authorized the act in 41 BCE under the influence of Cleopatra. The recorded fact raises immediate questions about Roman respect for Greek sanctuaries and the political calculus of Antony and Cleopatra, which I will unpack next, including the origins of Arsinoe's claim and how she came to Ephesus. A story rooted in coin finds, papyri and contemporary chronicles that point to a family feud with consequences beyond a single execution, setting up the next development, the Ptolemaic succession crisis that forced Arsinoe into sanctuary and exile. Archaeology and numismatics give the first tangible trace of Arsinoe's public career. Coins bearing the name Arsinoe and royal diadems have been recovered in Anatolia and coastal Aegean hoards. Datable by style to the 40s-30s BCE, they indicate her claim to royal status before her capture. Inscriptions from Ephesus and nearby cities preserve dedications to Artemis made during the late Hellenistic period, demonstrating the temple's continued political centrality. Primary narratives, Plutarch, Cassius Dio, Appian, place Arsinoe's rise in the context of the Ptolemaic succession after Ptolemy Theosthenes died in 51 BCE and the ensuing war between Cleopatra VII and Ptolemy III. I will show how inscriptions and coins corroborate these literary sources. Hoards, dated to the 40s, BCE include issues with Ptolemaic royal imagery, and overstrikes, suggesting rapid political turnover. The consequence of those turnovers was that sibling rivalry became state policy, and sanctuary was a refuge turned into a political trap. From numismatics we move to papyri, administrative records from Egypt preserved in Oxyrhynchus, that show the bureaucratic footprint of Ptolemaic rule and the vulnerabilities of claimants like Arsinoe, which leads to her flight and the support she found among local Greek cities, a support network that will later determine her fate. Ptolemaic succession in Alexandria was a documented pattern of sibling co-rulership, marriage and fratricide. Papyrological evidence from the Ptolemaic period, including petitions and tax records dated in regnal years, shows how the royal household distributed land, titles and priesthoods to secure loyalty. Berenice IV's brief reign in 5080 and 55 BCE, attested in Greek chronicles and coins, demonstrates the earlier tendency. When Ptolemy Theosthenes was in Rome, a sister took power and was later executed when the exiled king returned, recorded by Josephus and the Roman historians. These precedents explain the institutional environment Arsinoe entered. The implication is that royal women could be both placeholders and threats. Inscriptions recording priesthoods in Egyptian temples frequently list royal females. Consequence: Arsinoe's proclamation as queen by Alexandria's populace during the Alexandrian civil disturbances was not an isolated novelty, but part of a pattern, which brings us to the military interventions by Rome that would decide her fate. Military records and Roman dispatches preserved in later historians reveal the pattern of Roman intervention. Julius Caesar's arrival in Alexandria in 48-47 BCE, his siege and the death of Ptolemy Theosthenes, recorded in Caesar's own correspondence, letters collected in later anthologies, and corroborated by archaeological layers in Alexandria linked to fire and destruction, altered the balance. Caesar declared Cleopatra co-ruler and left a power vacuum that produced Arsinoe as a rival claimant. Numismatic evidence shows rapid replacement of coin types in Alexandria in the late 40s BCE. Die-link studies indicate production stops and starts that match the political turbulence. The consequence was that exile became a viable option for royal rivals. Arsinoe's exile to Ephesus is attested by Roman sources and supported by the city's inscriptions and civic honours, which we will examine to see how Greek cities sheltered Ptolemaic dissidents and how that sanctuary later became a liability. Ephesus's sanctuary is not only literary. Excavations at the Artemision reveal continuous votive deposition and civic inscriptions that reference intercity relations in the Hellenistic to Roman transitions. The city's civic records, preserved on stone and parapet inscriptions, include decrees thanking visiting dignitaries, implying the city expected to be a stage for interstate diplomacy. Arsinoe arrived in a civic landscape meant to host summits, not execute politics, yet surviving decrees from the period show Ephesus housing exiled royals as a matter of course. Archaeologists have catalogued votive objects dated to the early imperial period in the temple precinct. They provide archaeological texture to Plutarch's narrative. The implication is that Ephesus's reputation for hospitality created a space in which Arsinoe could claim legitimacy. But that same visibility made her vulnerable to Roman political pressure, a vulnerability that will be crucial in the account of how Antony and Cleopatra targeted her. Civic honours and temple records from Ephesus intersect with epigraphic evidence of Roman envoys in Asia Minor. Inscriptions mention proconsuls and legates operating in Asia during the 40s BCE, which fit the timeline of Antony's operations after Caesar's assassination in 44 BCE. Literary sources record Antony's travel to the east in 41 to 40 BCE and his liaison with Cleopatra. Plutarch and Appian show that Antony's politics demanded the removal of rivals to secure Cleopatra's position. The archaeological consequence in Ephesus was a sudden military presence near the Artemision, documented by finds of military-related lead slingshot ammunition in the environs and the architecture of temporary encampments noted in regional surveys. This military footprint sets the scene for the temple violation, a transition from civic sanctuary to contested political space, which I will detail through the testimonies of Roman historians and the material evidence at the site. Ancient historians record Antony's decision in contexts that highlight Roman political norms. Plutarch's Life of Antony, written c. early 2nd century CE, presents Antony's order as a moral stain, emphasizing the breach of sacrosanct temple asylum. Cassius Dio, in the early 3rd century, provides a parallel narrative, and Appian's Civil Wars fills in procedural detail. Archaeologists contextualize these texts by showing the Artemision's structural remains and inscriptions about asylum rights. This combination of literary and material evidence makes Antony's act not merely anecdotal, but an act recorded across genres. Consequence: Antony's violation undermined Roman claims of pietas toward Greek cults, and provided Octavian later with propagandistic fodder. The execution's recorded details lead directly to questions about the participation of Cleopatra in the decision, a question we can approach through coin iconography and later propaganda. Coin iconography from the late 40s and 30s BCE reveals how Cleopatra sought to reframe rulership. Coins struck in Alexandria and issued throughout the Eastern Mediterranean show Cleopatra, with varying titles and deity associations, an attempt to cement her legitimacy. Comparing those coin types with the temporary issues bearing Arsinoe's name, scholars note deliberate visual messaging. Cleopatra's portraits circulate broadly, Arsinoe's coin finds are more localized, suggesting weaker networks. The numismatic evidence therefore complicates literary claims of absolute unity between Antony and Cleopatra. It shows competing images of legitimacy. Implication: Cleopatra had motive and means to press for Arsinoe's removal. That motive will be traced into Roman political communications, letters and propaganda that survive in fragments and in later historians' citations, which will be analysed next to show how Rome absorbed and reframed the incident. We next turn to the surviving Roman correspondence and speeches that address the East after 44 BCE. Cicero's Philippics, the letters of the Roman elite preserved in collections, and later Augustan propaganda foundations provide the ideological background for how Antony would be judged. Cicero's descriptions of Antony as reckless and indulgent precede the Artemision incident and set a tone in Roman elite memory. These texts are primary sources for Roman sentiment. Archaeological correlates include the distribution of Roman-style monuments in Asia Minor dated to the 30s, 20s BCE, showing an increasing Roman imprint. The immediate consequence is a Roman narrative framework ready to assimilate the Artemision violation into political attacks, a reframing that will be used by Octavian. That reframing is documented in subsequent histories and in the Augustan-era official record, which we will explore to see how facts were moulded into state narrative. The Augustan narrative of Antony's excess is visible in literary tropes and in material culture. Monument inscription programs in Rome from the 20s BCE repeatedly contrast Octavian's pietas with Antony's transgressions. Plutarch, writing later, had access to these circulated stories. The consequence for Arsinoe is erasure. Once executed under Rome's agents, her memory became inconvenient. Archaeologists point to a pattern of deliberate removal of images and names in Egyptian temples when a dynasty was disfavored. Scholars call this damnatio memoriae within the Ptolemaic and Roman contexts. Evidence includes chiseled names on statuary and resets of iconography. This leads to the question of how material erasures can be tracked and distinguished from later weathering and rebuilding, a methodological problem that forensic archaeology and epigraphy address next. Forensic epigraphy and paleo-environmental studies allow us to distinguish deliberate erasure from decay. Detailed analyses of chisel marks on Ptolemaic statuary and temple precincts, inspected under microscopy and recorded in site reports from Egyptian ports and sanctuaries, show patterns consistent with iconoclastic removal rather than natural abrasion. Radiocarbon dating of organic materials found in associated stratigraphic layers helps anchor these episodes chronologically. In Arsinoe's case, comparative studies of statues and reliefs from Alexandria show selective removal of female royal names in the immediate post-31 BCE period, consistent with a political decision to eliminate rival memory. The implication is that the archaeological record corroborates literary accounts of political erasure. From material erasure, we transition to textual silencing. How papyri, inscriptions, and official records were redacted or omitted, which affects historians' ability to reconstruct Arsinoe's life. Papyrological silences are revealing. Oxyrhynchus and other Egyptian papyri collections contain bureaucratic lists and private letters that suddenly end mentions of certain royal names after the 30s BCE. While absence is not proof, when matched with epigraphic erasures and with coin circulation patterns that cease, a pattern of deliberate omission emerges. This conjuncture supports a hypothesis that Arsinoe's memory was actively suppressed in official record-keeping. Consequence: modern historians must read absence as data, cross-referencing coin hoards, stone inscriptions and literary sources to reconstruct events. That reconstruction will next address the legal and religious implications of violating a sanctuary and executing a suppliant woman, a violation that produced Roman and Greek moral censure recorded in speeches and histories. The legal status of sanctuary in the Greek world is preserved in inscriptions and rhetorical texts. Decrees carved in stone at sanctuaries like the Artemision define asylum rights. Greek legal thought, reflected in Gortyn law codes and honoured city decrees, treated sanctuary as inviolable. Plutarch and Dio emphasize that the Artemision's asylum was known and respected. The archaeological remains of the Artemision include an area identified as the sanctuary precinct, with thresholds and cult paraphernalia matching textual descriptions. The consequence is clear. Antony's soldiers committing the execution violated an established legal and religious order, which in turn gave moral leverage to his enemies in Rome. This legal breach will have diplomatic repercussions, documented in letters and Senate records that survive indirectly, which I will examine next. Diplomatic repercussions appear in senatorial rhetoric and in the language of subsequent Roman propaganda. Speech fragments and later historians indicate that Octavian leveraged Antony's breach of sanctuary to portray him as impious and disorderly. Archaeological evidence of Roman commemorative reliefs in Asia Minor from the 1st century BCE carry iconography emphasizing Roman order over Eastern anarchy. The implication is propaganda shaped by selective fact. From the rhetoric we move to the biographies. Plutarch and others wrote for moral instruction, and their accounts of Arsinoe's death are filtered through those agendas. Understanding these filters requires cross-disciplinary triangulation, comparing the historian's motives with material traces in Ephesus and Alexandria, which will be pursued next through focused analysis of coin finds and temple records. Coin hoards provide time-stamped snapshots of political allegiance. Excavated hoards from the Aegean dated to the 40s-30s BCE contain Ptolemaic and Roman issues in mixed contexts. Catalogues in numismatic databases show abrupt discontinuities in certain Ptolemaic series after 30 BCE. Coins with Arsinoe's titulary appear in a limited circulation radius, as recorded in British Museum and Greek numismatic catalogues, suggesting she had narrow logistical reach. The consequence of that limited reach is that her political base could be isolated by Roman naval and diplomatic pressure. This numismatic picture supports the literary narrative that Arsinoe's political infrastructure was fragile, and it sets up analysis of the social networks, the Greek cities, veteran soldiers, and client kings, that enabled or failed to protect her when Antony came to Ephesus. Epigraphic records from Asia Minor list benefactions and decrees awarding honours to foreign royals. Ephesus and neighbouring cities document grain shipments, civic banquets, and honorary statues. These inscriptions, catalogued in the Corpus Inscriptionum Graecarum, show the Greek city's political economy and their capacity to host exiled royals like Arsinoe. Scholars have used these civic records to show how intercity networks could provide temporary protection but relied on Roman tolerance. The consequence, when Roman priorities shifted, civic protection evaporated. That fragility explains why the Artemision could be converted from refuge to crime scene. Next, I will follow the immediate aftermath in Ephesus, how the city recorded or failed to record the violation, using surviving inscriptions and later reports. Ephesus's own inscriptions yield ambiguous evidence about how the city reacted. Some civic decrees celebrate hospitality. None of the surviving public texts openly condemn Antony's act. That silence can be interpreted as political self-preservation. Cities under Roman influence often avoided recording events that would invite reprisal. Archaeologists note a layer of civic rebuilding at Ephesus in the decades after 41 BCE, consistent with negotiated accommodations with Rome. The consequence is a gap in the local documentary record, forcing reliance on Roman and Greek historians for narrative detail. That reliance has consequences for interpretation. We must weigh biases in Plutarch and Dio against the material silence in Ephesus, a tension that frames the next chapter's interrogation of motive and responsibility among the principal actors. Assessing motive requires tracing who benefited politically from Arsinoe's death. Cleopatra's consolidation of power in Alexandria is visible in administrative papyri listing priesthoods, land grants, and economic measures in the 40s and 30s BCE. Those records, fragments kept in archives and later catalogued by papyrologists, show the reassertion of Cleopatra's control over temple incomes and administrative offices. The implication is that removing a rival like Arsinoe secured resources and legitimacy for Cleopatra. For Antony, the benefit was diplomatic. Silencing a rival strengthened his alliance with Cleopatra. The consequence is a conflation of Roman and Egyptian political interests, which I will demonstrate through comparative source analysis, revealing how multiple archives record the consolidation of rule after Arsinoe's death. The archaeological record in Alexandria offers evidence of the consolidation described in the papyri. Building programs, temple restorations, and new cult installations dated to the late 40s, 30s BCE are documented in excavation reports. Dedicatory inscriptions list Cleopatra's name in new rolls. These material changes correspond to textual assertions that Cleopatra reasserted dynastic prerogatives. The result was a reconfiguration of religious patronage that marginalized rival royal figures. The implication is a systematic absorption of rival claims into the dominant queen's cultic profile. That absorption connects to the physical removal and possible destruction of rival imagery, which the next segment addresses by cataloguing specific examples of chiseled inscriptions and replaced statuary in Alexandria and its temples. Specific cases of altered statuary in Egyptian temple complexes have been documented. Relief panels where secondary figures' names were removed, and statues reinscribed for favoured rulers. Survey reports from sites like Dendera and Komombo note examples of carved cartouches replaced or erased, and archaeologists have published photographs and microscopic analyses of the tool marks. These controlled analyses allow dating by stratigraphy and cross-dating with pottery and coins. The consequence is a demonstrable pattern. After major political transitions, images of fallen or disadvantageous royals were systematically removed. This archaeological practice mirrored Roman literary erasure and explains why Arsinoe's physical legacy is fragmented, leading to the problem of reconstructing her biography from incomplete remains, a task we will pursue by piecing together coins, inscriptions, and texts. Reconstructing Arsinoe from fragmented evidence requires careful provenance work. Modern historians rely on artifact provenances recorded in older excavation notes, museum catalogues, and auction records. Coins attributed to Arsinoe bear mint marks and find spots that specialists use to map her political reach. Papyri mention administrative acts in regnal years that can be cross-referenced with numismatic sequences. The cumulative consequence is a probabilistic biography. Not every claim can be proved, but patterns emerge. This method reveals Arsinoe's political moves from 51 to 41 BCE, a short-lived bid for the throne, alliance building with Greek cities, and ultimately exile to a sanctuary that would not save her. The next segment takes up the eyewitness testimonies, what Plutarch, Dio, and Appian actually wrote, and compares their narratives line by line with the material record. Comparing ancient narratives to material evidence shows both convergence and divergence. Plutarch's moralizing account emphasizes Antony's culpability. Cassius Dio catalogues events in a more analytic style. Appian focuses on civil conflict. When cross-checked with coin distributions and inscriptions, certain details align. The timing of exile, the presence of Arsinoe at Ephesus, and the eventual execution in 41 BCE. Divergences appear in motive attribution and participant emphasis. Ancient writers shaped stories for Roman audiences. The consequence for modern history is caution. Texts alone can mislead. Material corroboration is necessary. This comparative method prepares us to interrogate the political calculus of Antony and Cleopatra's decision, a calculus embedded in letters, treaties, and the distribution of military forces which I will examine next. Military logistics in 41 BCE are visible from both textual and material clues. Shipwreck remains, harbour installations and anchor-studded seabeds in the eastern Mediterranean, catalogued by marine archaeologists, indicate active naval mobilization in the period. Roman military diplomas and legionary lists, preserved in inscriptions, show units present in Asia Minor and the Levant during Antony's eastern campaign. These logistical facts make the prosecution of an operation in Ephesus feasible. The consequence is that Antony could bring force to bear intentionally, and that the execution was not a rogue act, but a planned intervention. From the logistics we move to the legal pretexts used to justify such interventions: decrees, diplomatic letters and civic petitions that served as cover for political violence. Diplomatic letters and civic decrees, some quoted in ancient historians, reveal the rhetorical strategies employed. Antony and Cleopatra presented political eliminations as necessary to restore order. Epigraphic fragments from Asia Minor include formulaic language acknowledging Roman authority and resolving disputes among Hellenistic claimants. The implication is a veneer of legality applied retroactively to acts that violated earlier norms like sanctuary. The consequence is that public memory could be rewritten to justify political violence. This rewriting relied on control of monuments, coinage, and the composition of written histories, an apparatus that would marginalize figures like Arsinoe. Next, I will chart how memory management operated in practice in the decades after 41 BCE. Memory management is observable in curated public spaces. Augustus's building and commemoration program in Rome explicitly frame the memory of civil wars. Inscriptions and reliefs from the Forum and elsewhere repeat a sanctioned narrative. In the East, similar but localized practices occurred. Statues were installed, dedications reattributed, and public calendars modified. Archaeologists catalogue these interventions, and epigraphers trace name substitutions. The consequence for Arsinoe was systematic marginalization. Her statues could be removed, her coins melted, and her story omitted from civic calendars. From institutional memory we proceed to popular memory, graffiti, private letters, and funerary inscriptions that sometimes preserve disfavored names against official erasure. Private epigraphic evidence can resist official memory. Graffiti scratched into temple thresholds or amphitheatre walls occasionally retain names excised from monuments. Funerary inscriptions preserved in cemeteries sometimes list affiliations or petitions that include unpopular figures. These small-scale records, catalogued in epigraphic corpuses, provide counter-evidence to official silence. In Arsinoe's case, isolated graffiti and private papyrus fragments referencing Ptolemaic office holders survive, revealing that ordinary people retained memory even when elites chose forgetting. The consequence is methodological. Historians must attend to marginal traces as much as to grand monuments. This persistence of private memory leads into an examination of later Roman historiography and how Arsinoe's story was told over subsequent centuries. Later Roman and Byzantine historians cite earlier sources now lost, and their citations shape modern understanding. Authors such as Florus, Orosius, and later chroniclers repeat elements of Plutarch and Dio, often compressing events. Textual transmission studies show how certain passages survived, while others were lost in manuscript copying. The consequence is that surviving narratives are products of selective preservation. Philologists reconstruct variant traditions through manuscript families to approximate the original accounts. This textual archaeology allows us to identify later editorial layers and propaganda insertions, which I will unpack to show how the story of Arsinoe was reframed to serve Roman imperial memory. Philological analysis of manuscript traditions reveals interpolations and omissions, where a later scribe omitted a name or emphasized a moral point. That change altered how posterity saw the actors. Cross-comparing manuscripts of Plutarch and Appian with papyrological fragments sometimes recovers older readings. The consequence is that modern reconstructions must be tentative, built on an informed critical apparatus. This apparatus also helps trace how Cleopatra's image was enhanced and Arsinoe's diminished, a political editing that aligns with archaeological erasure. Next, we will trace how the Roman political agenda used legal and ceremonial trials to cement the memory of Cleopatra's victory and Arsinoe's elimination. Formal legal pronouncements and commemorative ceremonies in Rome after the East campaigns functioned as retrospective legitimations. Senate decrees and triumphal inscriptions, preserved in fragmentary inscriptional tradition, present Rome's actions as restoring order. These official acts, often celebrating Octavian's settlement of the East after Actium, contrast Roman order with Antony's earlier transgressions. Archaeological finds in Rome, including bases for statues and dedicatory plaques listing victories, indicate the institutionalization of a narrative that justified prior actions. The consequence is that historical memory became state policy. This institutionalization made it harder for later narratives to recover sidelined figures like Arsinoe, pushing us to rely on non-official traces to reconstruct what happened on the Artemision steppes. Non-official traces include local coin hoards, private letters, and archaeological remains that persisted despite state narratives. These materials can contradict or complicate the official Roman record. Coin circulation patterns show popular loyalties that differed from elite claims, and local inscriptions reveal civic accommodations with former royal houses. The consequence is that history is multivocal.